Opportunity to join us. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Wiley, for your presence and your help with this course. And thank you to Sheila and Shantideva for bringing us all together. And as Wiley just mentioned, for those of you who are here for the first time, we've spent the last couple of weeks talking through our relationship to emotions. And tonight we're going to shift into desire and envy out of grief and mourning, which I'm aware is a feeling that many people are experiencing now. But I hope that our conversation tonight will also be helpful, illuminating in some way. And what we'll do tonight is take a little bit of time at the beginning. I'll share some slides with you, and then I'll open it up for your thoughts, your reflections, questions, and then we'll close with a guided practice. Okay, so on that note, and Chantel, lovely to see you, my friend and colleague from Nalanda. So glad you're with us. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, how's that looking? Can everybody see it? All right, great.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm aware that a little bit like fear and anxiety, there's often confusion around the nuances, the differences between desire, and then when you get into envy, the difference between envy and jealousy, etc. And so I'm going to start us off tonight focusing on what Buddhist psychology has to say about desire. And interestingly, it's front and center. When you start to explore this healing tradition, you'll begin to notice right away that the Buddha wanted to help us think about, reflect upon just how prominent desire is in the psyche, in the human condition. And interestingly, for this reason, he suggested that desire and or attachment, right, which is not necessarily the same thing, but it's in a similar terrain, is a central struggle, right? Most of us have lots of desires and lots of people and experiences and fantasies that we can get attached to. Then the question is, what happens after we form the attachment, right? Are we conscious of that experience of attachment, right? How do we struggle with it? Do we tolerate the limits of what we can hold on to, right? And so right away, we're encouraged to think about what it means to feel desire and then how we cultivate relationship to it. And as you all know who have been studying the Dharma, the other two primary struggles, I tend not to use the translation poison, but that's often how they're taught, as the three poisons. I think of them as three primary obstacles or struggles: our aversion or ill will, and then more foundationally, our struggle to see things clearly, right? To recognize how relationally embedded we are, all phenomena is, and that would be one way of describing ignorance. So in the original teachings, the Buddha Shakyamuni once again said, if we're going to think about the human condition, then we do need to think about our suffering. Right? There's nobility, right? These are the noble truths. There's nobility in reflecting on the nature of suffering, so that we have some agency to potentially reduce it, so that suffering isn't too dominant in our lived experience. And if we want to try to understand what it is that drives suffering, desire has a lot to do with it. And he said it's this feeling of thirst, it's this feeling of wanting something that we can't get enough of, that, and then the ensuing frustration or pervasive unsatisfactoriness. It's one of my favorite Buddhist words, unsatisfactoriness. And many people can relate, because often there's something that we desire and we might get it, but then lo and behold, there's some new desire that's replacing it. It's rare that we really rest in a feeling of fulfillment. Right? It's enough. We're coping, right? We're fulfilled, we're at peace. And so the Buddha suggested that if we can be curious about that experience of thirst, of desire, right, then we'll actually be heading in the right direction toward understanding our suffering, reducing our suffering, and then moving toward a path of well-being, of a well-lived life. But first, we really do need to just stay curious about why it is we so often experience that sense of wanting more, of needing something that's elusive. Right? The older I get, the more I really appreciate just how vexing this can be, because it can interfere with the contentment that most people want. It can interfere with that sense of getting where you long to get and then being able to stay there psychically, right? To enjoy where you are. So if we start to unpack what it is that causes that experience of craving, of thirst, the Buddha suggested that we're basically susceptible to getting addicted to things that seem inherently by their nature pleasurable. That human beings have this tendency to invest permanent characteristics in transient experiences or sources of pleasure. Right? We see, for me, it's the vegan ice cream, right? The vegan ice cream is going to usher in delight, joy, fun, well-being, but it doesn't last, right? It's a temporary experience. And you can just think about whatever it is that has gotten linked for you to some sense of comfort or pleasure or ease, right? And it is this false link, right, between the transient experience and the longing for an abiding well-being that leaves us caught, right? That gets us snagged in an experience. And then it's tempting, right, when that's begun, to start to feel stuck in a cycle, right, of wanting more of that pleasurable experience and avoiding anything that might interfere with it, right? And once we're caught, then that nagging sense of thirst, right, starts to emerge. And sadly, it's usually a thirst for a substitute source of well-being. And this is the tricky thing that I've noticed about the ways we sublimate our desire to feel an abiding sense of wellness, is that the mind does tend to get fixated on what will temporarily offer something that simulates that experience of well-being. Right? It's a substitute source. It's just that staying with what's longed for takes work. It is arduous. And again, the older I get, the more I appreciate just how arduous it is and how tempting it is to instead find something that at least ushers in the, the transient experience of pleasure. But it doesn't get us out of that cycle, that nagging loop. Yeah. So in psychotherapy, there are insights that are similar to the insights of the Buddha. They're not exactly the same, but there are some interesting parallels. Freud, when he began writing about the human condition, like the Buddha Shakyamuni, said that we really do need to think carefully about our relationship to desire in order to have any chance of a good life, a pleasurable life, a meaningful life, but also so that we are less susceptible to causing harm. And he suggested that there's actually a cavernous gap between what's desired deep within the mind and the limits that society imposes. Right? He suggested, for those of you who are familiar with Freud, you know well that we have different segments of the mind, that there's a part of the mind he referred to as the id that just wants what it wants when it wants it and is completely unconcerned with limits, right? Not interested in limits being imposed. And we have a similar concept in Buddhist psychology of the hungry ghost. More, give me more. I just need and want more. But the hungry ghost can't take in the nourishment that's longed for. So they're just constantly saddled with frustration. Freud said something similar, that because there's this gap between desire and civilization, that we end up with discontentment. We end up with this chronic sense of frustration or frustrated need. And so he suggested that if we're going to work toward a more conscious life, if we're going to grapple with the truth of having some segment of the mind that is filled with desire, that we might need to settle for what he referred to as common unhappiness. We might need to grapple with the fact that it is frustrating to have a part that's just laden with need and not be able to have those needs gratified. And I identify with that struggle. I would articulate it differently because I think we can do better than common unhappiness. We learn this in the Dharma. We can actually feel well. We can feel joyful. We can feel deep fulfillment. Right? Our capacity for bliss, it's not really addressed in the psychoanalytic tradition. But I do appreciate his sage insight that there is a frustration that we encounter, right? Because of course there are desires that are thwarted. Right? There are desires that we sometimes feel for a very long time, and they seem so elusive, right? The gratification always seems slightly out of reach. Yeah. And so he said there's actually an ethical component to noticing that, right? Noticing the gap or the difference between what's desired and what's possible. Because when we do that work, then we're less likely to find ourselves in an internal state of conflict. I have noticed as a person and as a clinician that there is often tension between the parts that are filled with need. You can think of those parts as permitting parts or the id, and the parts that function like a reflector of external values or values that were transmitted by parents, grandparents, etc. And Freud described that part as the superego. Many contemporary therapists would describe that part as a critical protector part, or the part that says, you cannot want that. You shouldn't want it. Think of what people are deprived of, right? Why are you always wanting so much, right? Those parts can be a little punitive and a little shaming, right? It's just that when these two parts get too polarized, then what can happen is we end up in this chronic seesaw, right? With one part dominating while the other part goes underground. And it's that seesaw experience that can drive people a little crazy, right? And this comes up around addiction or any compulsivity, anything that doesn't feel like a choice, right? Where there's one part saying, oh yes, we're having it. And then the next day or later that night, there's another part saying, why, right? Why couldn't you tolerate not having it? And so part of what Freud was suggesting is that if we can bring these parts into more active conversation, then some new possibility can emerge, right? Some new way of being in relationship to desire can emerge that's actually illuminating. Yeah. So in the Buddhist tradition, there are many ways to work with our struggles with desire. A primary way, and I have really appreciated this, the suggestion, is to start by noticing more, exploring the nature of what's desired. Right? And this is where our mindfulness practice is so helpful, to simply observe with as little judgment as possible, and then begin to discern, right? Is the object of our desire actually offering what we're longing for or seeking? Right? Often the answer is no, but not always. It's just a very helpful question to consider. And if it's not offering what's really needed and desired, is it a setup for this cycle of addiction and chronic frustration, unsatisfactoriness? Yeah. Now, of course, it's not enough to stop with a discernment. Many people who are sensitive and conscious will notice that there's something they're longing for, but that longing is getting sublimated through, you name it, food, sex, work, even political views or attachment to theory, attachment to certain healing approaches, etc. There's usually some additional efforts involved. But this initial discernment is a way of really helping us clarify what's involved in our relationship to desire. And if what it is we desire is perhaps a substitute, right, for a deeper longing, to begin to practice, and this does take some practice in my experience, to notice how we hold the desire. Is it possible to bring a little bit of levity to how we're holding it, so that we can start to tolerate the ephemeral experience of whatever pleasure is garnered? Yeah. And this, of course, can then be a practice that helps us hold everything lightly with tenderness, right? Including what is most precious to us. And as we're doing that in the Dharma, we're also encouraged to just notice if we're really nurturing desires for what's going to help us feel genuinely well. Right? And even to imagine allowing all of the more peripheral desires to get redirected, right? To use a clinical term, to decathect our desire, let's say for a particular kind of professional fame or achievement, or a personal experience that's gratifying, and to put all of that desire into the wish to be truly awake and well. And then this is what the Buddha suggested we can do. Of course, we don't have to get rid of all of our more mundane or secular desires. I think they can be fun. But to just notice that there's a lot of psychic energy, there's libido, right? To use a Jungian characterization of libido that goes into all of those desires that we can use to nurture the wish to be genuinely well with a mind that is open and curious, compassionate, insightful, etc. It's just that this process takes some effort, takes some time as we get a little bit more accustomed to transforming those more banal desires into the deeper desire for well-being that's potentially grounded in the desire for everyone, right? All beings to have wellness and ease and safety, compassion. Okay. So in the psychotherapeutic process, there are also many, many ways that we can begin to explore our relationship to desire. And the first, or maybe the primary approach, would be to make a lot of room for underlying wishes, underlying needs, right, that may have been displaced or sublimated. Because since the sublimation tends to happen outside of full conscious awareness, right? Many of us start to do this early in life, before we're verbal, before we're reflective. And so it becomes an entrenched way of coping that's really happening outside of our awareness. And so in a therapeutic process, we would begin to get curious about the deeper needs and wishes that perhaps have not been sufficiently tended to. Yeah. And I have found this to be so poignant, because most people, of course, will have certain needs that were not met, that were really quite important. Whether it's the need to feel sufficiently seen, the need to feel truly lovable, right? The need to feel that the contents of your mind matter, right? And have merit. The need to feel like you are a person of agency who can have an impact on the world. I mean, we have significant needs, and some of them may be met, and some of them probably won't be met fully. And so in therapy, there's an opportunity for two people to come together and use both of their minds to start to investigate, you know, is there a legacy of need here that needs to be cared for? more fully understood. Yeah. And so in that process, of course, the investigation would be very, very specific. This is one way in which psychotherapy is quite different from a Buddhist lens. The tendency is to lean in and really explore the details of someone's lived experience. And in this way to privilege our unique subjectivity. But we might also zoom out a little bit and then more broadly, more generally explore how were someone's needs tended to, how were needs or desires responded to in a family system, right? Some families will be very responsive when a child or an adult, any family member expresses a need. Right? People will pause and notice and be curious. Some family systems will feel very easily burdened by any need that's expressed, and so needs will frequently get ignored or problematized. Some families will notice need but then get anxious, right? Somebody needs something, right? And then the response can get a little inflamed, so that a child's growing experience of need gets linked with that anxiety, that inflammation. So whatever someone has experienced around need, it is usually illuminating to have a look at not just the particular needs that went unmet, but how someone has learned to be in relationship to desire and need. Yeah. And then throughout this whole process, to really allow for whatever gets stirred to come forward. Right? And this is, I would say, a primary way that psychotherapists practice compassion is they withhold the judgment about what somebody is experiencing and needing. So there may be a part that says, I do need more, I want more, I deserve more, and I need you to tell me how to get it. Right? And there's no pressure to be socialized and to be a good citizen, to be a nice Buddhist. You really get to speak from the desire and finally have that desire responded to, right, without any shaming. Sometimes that process alone starts to bring things into balance, right? The parts that are filled with desire feel a little more cared for and therefore less frustrated. Okay. How are we doing with time here? Good. So lastly, before I shift into envy, a pretty central part of the therapeutic process would also involve tending to the unconscious. Okay? And I'm not suggesting that it's just unmet desires that we house in the unconscious. I think we also house incredible gifts and capacities and talents. We house parts of the collective experience that are tough to hold in consciousness. And many of us do end up holding outside of awareness aspects of desire that were not sufficiently responded to in a way that legitimized the desire. And this is different for everybody, right? But it's not uncommon for something about sexuality to be problematized by a family, right? Something about physical desire, the desire for touch, the desire for care, right? The desire for closeness, the desire for fun. This is very common, which is why many people struggle to think about, talk about sexuality in a way that um, just takes the space that it needs and deserves. And again, this is a facet of psychotherapy that I think has offered many people who have been in therapy real compassion to finally have a place where sexual desire and physical desire can be more fully explored with respect, with curiosity, right, with an openness of mind and spirit. This is also true, of course, around the desire for closeness, for intimacy, for dependency. There are so many families that may attempt to legitimize those needs, but still subtly problematize them. And there's huge variability here. I mean, there are gendered components, right? Frequently, boys get more shaming around the desire for emotional embeddedness and dependency. And these are generalizations, but they have historically been generally true. Right? Girls might be more encouraged to want emotional closeness, but there are also families that are very oriented toward doing and productivity, and they are not feeling based. And so when a child expresses the desire for emotional holding, the message is conveyed that this is not something that should be bolstered, right? This is something that should be contained and sublimated. And so in therapy, there's an opportunity to finally affirm that these desires are part of the human condition, right? We are embodied, we are psychological. So the need for sexual closeness, emotional closeness, this is entirely human and natural. Yeah. So slowly, we might explore how we are working with these desires, what aspects of those desires we lift to awareness, and what aspects we keep outside of awareness. Okay. So, on that note, I'm going to shift now briefly to envy. And if you're like me, you may have noticed that envy is no fun. It feels dreadful. Right? It's a little worse than jealousy. Right? If you're really experiencing envy, it's almost intolerable. And there are reasons why. One of my primary psychoanalytic mentors, Anne Ulanov, who wrote a wonderful book on envy called Cinderella and Her Sisters. And we have an image here depicting Cinderella, suggested that when we're feeling envy, we're actually experiencing the wish to attack the good that we see someone else having or holding. And if we explore that, it's actually a denial of the good that we long for. Right? Now, one of the reasons why envy feels so bad is that the mind is not just envying the object, right, of desire. We get a little bit fixated on the person who seems to have the good, and then we want to get rid of that person. Is this resonating with you? Maybe. Some of you might know that experience. Somebody else has what you long for, and then you can't stand even hearing about that person. It'll drive you crazy, right? And in this way, envy can start to feel like an attack on being itself. And so Yulanov suggested that when we're struggling with envy, we're also struggling to stay conscious of the good that we have longed for. It's as if we're giving it to someone else. We hate them for it. They have what we need and want and long for. And so the real work is to tolerate the longing rather than trying to kill off those we envy. And so Anne used to say, she said this in class one day a long time ago, if somebody's bread just looks delicious and you hate them for having that bread, start baking. Yeah, it was a compelling teaching, right? It's actually very tough to do because envy does become a compelling grip, right? I mean, when hatred gets stirred and feelings of deprivation are in the mix, and sometimes there's injustice there too. I imagine there are many people right now who envy anyone who's not in a war-torn area, right? Anyone who gets to just carry on as if life were normal, right? The mind can get so agitated with envy, and it can generate a lot of hatred. And so the Buddha and mystics like Anne Ulanov suggested our way through that uh, vice grip is to reorient toward what it is we long for and are deprived of and are needing. Yeah. So this would be a process of redirecting our awareness, right? From the person or the group who has the good that's longed for to the good itself. And this is potentially going to help us get more curious about what it is we can do to generate the good. I think last week we talked a little bit about heroes. And in my experience, our heroes, people who offer extraordinary inspiration, do this. They notice deprivation, right? They tend to it. They tend to the suffering, usually of acute deprivation. But then they try to rally a collective curiosity about what can happen to rectify it. They do not stop with the deprivation, right? They keep their eyes on the prize of what is needed and deserved and longed for. And then they try to appeal to everybody's gifts and intelligence and insight and resilience and determination, skills of all kinds to collectively go into creating the good. Now, in order to do that, though, because that's a pretty tall task, in order to do that, we first have to consciously experience the deprivation. Right? This is something fundamentally different from envy and jealousy. It's staying with what has not been experienced but is longed for. And even risking feeling the hunger more directly. It's so interesting. Most people in my experience at this psychic juncture will either opt for some sublimation, right? Because they don't want to feel that hunger, that deprivation. They want some temporary experience of relief, or they will opt for the envy, which just creates a loop of agitation and frustration and hatred. And to some extent, that whole process suggests that there's been some struggle or even a failure of imagination. And I say that without any judgment whatsoever, because I have noticed that the mind sometimes gets a little skittish about imagining the good. Right? It's like we get close and then the protector part swoops in and says, don't go there. Don't even imagine you could have this. For fear of unbearable disappointment, right? For fear of some frustration that also seems too extreme to tolerate. It's just that when we begin to risk imagining the good, feeling it, living into it, accessing it, whatever it means for each one of us, usually there's also a sense of aliveness that comes with that imaginative process. Right? It's as if the mind suddenly gets more engaged, roomier, more expansive. So I'll say just a few words about some healing tools in both Buddhism and psychotherapy, since that process of uh, finding one's way out of the loop of envy and into the experience of generative creativity, accessing the good sounds so appealing, but is also so challenging. In the Dharma, a primary healing method is mindfulness practice. And I emphasize this because especially now that mindfulness has become such a common term, is so pervasive. I mean, probably every financial institution in the US has got some kind of mindfulness group and mindfulness coaches. And I mean, basically every facet of contemporary Western life has now incorporated the notion of mindfulness. But it is actually a challenging spiritual and psychological practice in which we can potentially tap into some bare attention as the lens through which we can notice how we are working with our desires. And are we working with our desires in a way that um, causes us to prematurely try to relinquish desire, right? Especially for those of us who have been influenced by Buddhist psychology. Sometimes it sounds like the message is if we can eliminate the longing, right? If we can uproot the desire, then we can finally be content. But really, the Buddha said that the problem is not with desire, it's how we are in relationship to it and whether or not what we desire can offer what we need and want. So, our mindfulness, right, that capacity to observe moment to moment in real time. Am I reaching for the thing that's going to give me 5 minutes of satisfaction? And am I doing that again and again? And when I don't do it, then what is felt? I'll share with you that some years back in my community, we do this practice that I really don't like called sojong, where we do prayers in the morning and then have lunch, and then there's no food after lunch, just more prayers. I really don't like that. I'm a New Yorker. Dinner means a lot to me. It's just woven into my sense of how life works. And so I resisted Sojong for decades until finally I agreed to do it for one night. I was supposed to do it for a month. I did it for one night. And what was so illuminating for me, I remember actually, this was very difficult because there was something going on in the world that there was breaking news. And so we're also not supposed to use entertainment, watch TV, no Netflix, blah, blah, blah. And so the thought of not knowing what was happening with the news and not having dinner, it just seemed really intolerable to me. And I remember sitting at my desk and I was reading some Dharma. I was drinking tea when I normally would have been having dinner and with friends, with loved ones. And I suddenly had the sense of humanity going away. Oh, right. I didn't know that for me, meals were so linked with the presence of the human family, that there was a deeper feeling of loss that was connected to food. And I probably could have described that intellectually, but I was not feeling it directly until I had some experience of not doing what I normally did to sublimate the desire for connection. So illuminating. Yeah. So mindfulness was really very helpful for me in that one night. I might risk doing Sojung again one day, knowing that mindfulness can be there, right, as an observing presence. In psychotherapy, we would do something similar. We would bolster our reflective capacity to be more curious about what's longed for and to be able to access more of a sense of choice. Right? Yeah. I mean, this is the interesting thing about our reflective capacity is that when we really start to hold in mind the deeper layers of what we're longing for, I think for me, it was some feeling of cohesive, abiding relationship. Mm. Then we know if that's what's longed for, okay, there may be things that can work to access it. We'll also notice what we're reaching for that might simulate the experience but doesn't actually provide it in any abiding way. So we would just try to keep the mind super reflective as we're grappling with both the desire and how we're in relationship to it. And then in both traditions, although in the Buddhist tradition, this is much more explicit, we would make efforts to tap into compassion. Because for those of you who have experienced unmet desires, and for those of you who have experienced envy, you know that there is a great deal of suffering involved. Right? I mean, there's a reason why these images of the hungry ghosts are so compelling for us. Most people can identify, right? To be filled with longing, but to not feel gratified. It is a suffering. It's an emotional hunger. And so in both traditions, although I really appreciate that in the Dharma, this is a beating heart, we can begin to work with that suffering with some tenderness, right? With respect. So that any critical parts are just not going to become too dominant, right? What's going to take more room in the mind is the part that says, this is hard. This is hard to have a need, right? A consuming desire, and to not be clear about how to meet it, and to see that other people somehow are experiencing, are living into what's longed for. And for me, it remains elusive. but then care about that experience. And the important thing about the compassion is that the more compassionate we are, the more reflective, the more mindful we will be. Right? The two go together. With the absence of compassion, the mindfulness and the reflection will tend to dissipate. Right? Because what will come into the mind instead of the compassion is the criticism, is the judgment. And so I just offer to you, as you're working through your own relationship to desire and envy, to see what it's like to let that part of your psychological and spiritual life start to mix with your compassionate heart, right? To be received by the part of you that cares, right? That cares about the struggle to desire and the complicated experience of envy. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to pause and I would love to hear from you. See what this is stirring. See if there are any questions or thoughts, reflections. Jan, hi.
Hi, Pilar. Thanks. This is a great teaching. This is wonderful. Thank you. And I really like the way you put it when you said if someone has that bread and it looks so good and you want it so bad, start baking. I did. I'm happy to say I did learn that lesson. That was about let's say 5-10 years ago. There was a show being put on, and I really wanted to be in this show. And I expressed to the person, oh, sure, I sure would love to be in your show. And she was like, yeah, really blew me off. And I could feel myself just about to go to envy and anger and hatred, but I caught myself and I booked my own show. And even though I was really scared, I did it. And I had a great time. Everybody had a great time. And so I rejoice at that.
That's awesome, Jan.
As a kid or in my 20s, I would have just been eaten up with jealousy. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a beautiful example, right, of how easy it could be to get caught in envy and anger and hatred, but then for some sense of possibility to emerge, right? That you don't have to give up what you're wanting. You just need a new way to access it. It's beautiful. Thank you. Sheila, hi.
Hi, could you explain the difference between envy and jealousy?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Sheila. So, somewhat similar to anxiety and fear, I think of them as cousins. It's not always easy to tease apart what's jealousy and what's envy. Although affectively with jealousy, there's usually there's less anger, there's less hatred, there's also less aversion toward the person or the group that has what looks good, which is why talking about jealousy is not so fraught, right? Not as fraught as talking about envy. We can more readily notice that yes, there's something that looks really good that someone has, and we would like it too. But it doesn't touch into the depths of deprivation that I think gets stirred with envy. I also think that with jealousy, there's still a sense of possibility involved. that has been split off with envy. Does that help, Sheila? Okay. Great. Thank you. Lauren, hi.
Hi. Um, I thought that was an interesting question, Sheila, because I was thinking a lot during this teaching about how I struggle with jealousy in relationships. And I thought it was still all pretty applicable, at least to my personal experience, because I think in the past, I've really struggled with feeling like, oh, why is my partner paying so much attention to this other person? I can't trust him. He's betraying me. And it's less about being envious of the person who has the good that I want. And there's this middleman who's sort of like receiving the anger that's stirred up by it for me. But I think at its root, it is the same problem, because when I force myself listening tonight to really question what was the good in that scenario that I was envious of, it was like all about the confidence and the like desirable traits that this other person had, and maybe they were really talented, or maybe they were like just particularly like um seemed very like assured of themselves and in a very attractive way. And it's like, yeah, those are the qualities that I should just be trying to cultivate in myself. And if I were to maybe have a better grasp on my own identity and feel like I have things to offer, I wouldn't feel so threatened by it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's interesting where you ended up, because you put your finger on it, I think, in terms of the sense of threat, that maybe what's longed for is the feeling of security, right? To be secure in relationship, right? And to trust that the connection is abiding. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Eileen, hi.
Hi, thank you so much. Here's just a thought and a question I have. Dealing with all these kind of unmet needs, whether it's through fantasy we're feeling it, or envy, seeing something on Facebook you wish you had, or whatever it is that goes on. But there's always that question of being honest about what our needs are, but also reflecting so that we don't take actions that are perhaps would hurt someone else, or even cause more, disruption in one's own life that would not be a good thing in the final analysis. Because you kept stressing, we have to understand our needs in terms of, are they for the greater good, or are they something for our well-being? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to
It does, yeah. Do you want to give an example, or is there anything that comes to mind as
well, sure. Let's say, you're in a long-term relationship, but you have a need, for instance, of getting away or experiencing something else, but you don't want to jeopardize the relationship, So you're always trying to balance this out in a way. It's easy to get frustrated with someone else when it's something about our own desire and needs that are not being met.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Eileen. This is a key point, because it's challenging to just stay with desire. I mean, this is why mindfulness is such an arduous spiritual practice, to just feel it. One way of evacuating the feeling is to get fixated on the person in this example who seems to thwart the desire. And it's one reason why relationships are so tough because of our tendency to do that. And to your point, when we can shift the focus from the person who's getting in the way to what we're needing. So I really appreciate your example. Sometimes with intimate relationship, there is also the need for aspects of life that do not involve partnership or do not involve that person. And it can feel like a little bit of a conundrum of having to choose, either the partnership or the life that feels linked with other experiences.
Yes.
But the process of just staying with the need can illuminate some of the layers, right? The need may not be to, and you didn't suggest this, but if we just stay with the example, the need may not be to become a monastic or, to jump ship altogether and go off the grid. The need may be to recalibrate life a bit
Mhm, mhm.
so that there's protected space and time for other aspects of life.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. Other questions or reflections? Mona, hi.
Hi. I was having two kind of different just thought processes going on. Maybe I'll just start with one. So there's an experience I have where, like when I was younger, I was a gymnast and a dancer, and that was just from when I was very young. So I did all these kind of like things with my body that were, it was flexible, etc. And I'm very far from that reality right now. That's just part of life for everyone. But there's definitely some part of me that feels like I could be, it didn't have to be this far from it, but anyway, it's far from it. And when I watch, dancers or gymnasts, it's just such a complex feeling, but there's a deep wish, longing, desire, like to have that kind of freedom in the physical, form.
Mm.
And so that's just something I experience. And I wonder if there, like, okay, ways to work with it. I mean, I think definitely the like sublimate or just like I'm grateful and like, I can do a lot and obviously I'm better than most of the rest of the world, there's that path. But then the other path of like going into it a bit more, I'm just curious if there's any, it's not a real exactly what my question is, but if you had any thought on how to work with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other one is like a totally different other direction thought that I was having. So I don't know if you had anything to say about this first one.
Yeah, I'll respond and then you can share your second thought or question with us. I mean, the body is so interesting, right? It's often seemingly a source of frustrated desire and envy for some of the reasons that you're alluding to. Over time, our bodies don't function the way they once did, and that can be very provocative. And my sense is there is value to almost letting the feelings be an object of focus, right? Even to meditate into the desire or the jealousy or the envy, to see what emerges from it, right? It might be some other experience of elasticity, of freedom that's represented by the body, or it might actually be an embodied experience of freedom that takes some new form. But this is, I think, the great gift of staying with jealousy and envy is what can emerge out of it. It's almost an alchemical process. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I think I definitely experience it as a longing more than, at least in a conscious way. It doesn't feel like I envy that person, but it more just feels like I wish, I wish, I wish, you know.
Mhm.
So, but thank you. That could be interesting too.
Mm.
I don't want to, if someone else had a question, I could delay mine, but not.
Well, we have time. Yeah. Feel free to bring in
Okay.
your second
All right.
thought. Sure.
I'm backpedaling on my second one here now. So, um, it, because you're talking about both desire and envy, I was just thinking on desire, on the desire front, how the people that there's a certain type of person that I get very attracted to, who not exclusively, but one particular type who is like the poet, the writer, the artist, and there's so much like I become like so hooked. I want to be near this person. Like I want to, you know, be in a relationship with this person. And so I have just been reflecting. I don't again experience it as envy, but there's some part of me that's like, I wish I could be that, but like, so then I'll be close to that. So then that somehow, you know, feels correct or feels good. And so I was just, you know, a friend once was like, well, why don't you just write the book? You know, like you seem to go for all these writers. Maybe you need to write a book. And I was like, I don't know what, I'm not sure like what it's exactly, you know, about other than an admiration. But yeah, so it's just kind of curious because it's very I vow like never an artist, no more, not again. And then it's just very sticky. It's very, there's a strong hook there. So I just, I don't know if there's any thought about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mona. I mean, idealization is very interesting because I hear the, you know, the flavor of idealization and this experience of attraction. And
Very preliminary stage. Yes, so it is exactly that. It's not like I'm gonna just keep going if someone is, you know, but exactly. I think you
yeah,
said it, you nailed it. Yeah.
yeah. And the interesting thing about idealization, it is actually similar to desire and envy. The challenge is to slowly withdraw the idealization and to start to locate it internally. And I don't think it's necessarily so concrete as cultivating a particular path or skill that's, you know, that's attractive in others, but it is a withdrawing of the idealization to grow something intrapsychically. And folks like Kohut, in his work on development, he said ideally this happens when we're 4, 5, 6 years old. First several years, we might idealize the capacities in a caregiver, even a problematic caregiver. They seem to know how to do stuff. They can drive a car. They know what a rear view mirror is. They can have conversations on their phone. They write something, it's a check, then they know how to go. I mean, there's all this stuff that adults can do that seems really very extraordinary. Ideally, over time, we start to withdraw. We don't split off from the idealization, but we locate the capacity internally. And he said the more skilled care providers, they help with that process by frustrating a child in a manageable way. He called it optimal frustration. So basically, it's their way of saying to the kid, okay, you think I'm great. That's lovely. I do kind of like it. And I'm human too. I have some struggles too, right? I have limitations. The best spiritual mentors, the best, most seasoned therapists, they do something similar. They convey to the people they're helping. I realize that you think that I've got it all figured out and I'm not just a giant ball of neuroses. But the truth is a little bit more complicated than that. Right? In a boundaried way, they show their humanness so that the idealization can be withdrawn. Yeah. Thank you, Mona. So we have time for Barry. Hi. Good to see you.
Thank you. The body again, as I think I had a great early and late retirement. Everyone was saying, "Oh, you're in such great say 15 years ago, you're in such great shape, and I'm enjoying everything." You people say you're in the top things that no one knows. You're in the top 1% for a 70-year-old, and you're writing stuff. And then the last 2 years has been shit. In terms of just dealing with orthopedic factors. And I find almost a combination envy and anger. I see someone, go for walks along the river, and I see someone running along, and I used to do that just a couple of years ago, and you're even ignoring me. You probably think I'm just an old man. And so I feel I'm almost envious at the human condition at times. It's not my whole life going around angry at everyone, but it's hard for me to accept the old age. And in some way, I want to believe that other elements of things I've done well are a part of me. They are a part of me, but it's a secret part because other people other than who knew me for a long time don't know my secret, that I'm not just a doddering old man. So I'm not exactly sure how to deal with it, but I loved how you were talking to Myrna about it in this, I think it's Myrna, this sense of meditating and something will emerge. I have no idea what would emerge, but anyway, I'd like to hear you talk about that.
Thank you so much, Barry. Yeah, I mean, you're reminding me that the longing for the good sometimes also comes from the loss of the good that you once experienced. And so I just appreciate what it's like also to feel that loss, right? And then maybe even to feel like one sense of self changes accordingly, right? Because the way you're perceived is changing. Yeah, so it's not easy. And that's, of course, fodder for compassion. Right? It's not easy when the body undergoes changes and we lose capacities that we once had, or there's pain, there's discomfort, right? There are limitations. But I'm glad you're curious about this possibility of just even meditating on the envy, meditating on the anger. My teacher loves to meditate on anger. He can do it for hours. He says he stays with it. It's like a fun house / horror house. He just keeps going through these different twists and turns of the mind. And then he sees where he comes out. It can be very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. So, my friends, shall we close out with a practice? All right, terrific. Jan, yeah.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to make something clear. When I
Sure.
said, when I talked about learning that lesson, I certainly didn't mean to imply like I learned it, I'm done, I'm cooked. This will come up for me over and over again. I just wanted to make sure that it didn't come out sounding like, oh yeah, learned that lesson. Heck no. It will come up
Jan,
time and time again, I'm sure.
thank you. And those moments stay with you, though, right? The moments of awakening, they stay with you. Yeah. Okay, my friends. So I just invite you to first take a moment or two. Feel free to stretch a little bit, even if you need to stand, or rotate your ankles, your wrists, your neck, your shoulders. Really taking your time as you begin to settle into a posture that feels grounded and uplifted. Allowing your body to begin to settle into the support of your chair or your cushion or sofa. Noticing what it's like to release into that support. And as you're doing so, you can begin to notice the various sensations of the breathing body. Just feeling the flow of air coming and going. Noticing the expansion in the abdomen, and the rising and falling of the chest. And cool air coming and going from the nostrils. And if it's helpful, especially if your mind is super active, you can take 3 or 4 nice slow breaths, like savoring the in-breath and touching into deepening feelings of relaxation on the out-breath. Almost as if there were nothing to do but breathe. Nothing to be fixed. Just one in-breath followed by an out-breath. Allowing the breath to fall into its own natural rhythms. So that it becomes completely unforced, truly spontaneous and subtle. As the mind is beginning to enjoy this sense of rest, with gentleness, I invite you to call to mind something that you are aware you have desired. Just see it in your mind's eye. It can be an experience or a person, an opportunity, a situation, a capacity. With spaciousness, with gentleness, see what it's like to simply allow this desire to abide in your mind. Noticing if there are feelings that get stirred. There might be some sadness or some determination. Just imagine the mind growing yet more expansive and roomy. Imagining that there is a spaciousness in your mind for this desire and for how you have been in relationship to it. Noticing if there's anything that would be helpful to reflect upon in how you have managed this desire. Is there a way in which you have worked to camouflage it, to get distance from it? For just this next minute or two, allowing yourself to mentally be in contact with this desire as you hold it in your mind. Notice what it's like for you to keep your awareness. Make efforts to keep your awareness in contact with this desire. Noticing if the mind makes efforts to go elsewhere. And if so, with real gentleness, setting the intention to revisit this desire you have communed with, you have sat with in your practice. And to see if there might be something meaningful, something even healing in working more consciously with this desire. And perhaps also imagining that these healing efforts will have countless ripple effects for others. As you bring your intelligence and your compassion and your respect to this desire, so too may others notice in your process the potential for deeper fulfillment, feelings of aliveness, and abiding well-being. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Shantideva, for bringing us together. It was a total joy to be with you these last few weeks. And I know that we're going through a challenging time in the world, so I will be thinking of you all, wishing you well, and just deeply grateful for your practice, for your efforts, because I really do trust collectively, right? We can work toward the healing that we so dearly need. So thank you for being a part of this course. And Sheila and Snehi and Wiley, Jan, so much gratitude for all of you. And I hope to see you again soon. Be well, friends. Feel free to unmute if you want to say goodnight.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Wiley.
Thank you,
Thank you
Pilar.
so
Thank
much.
you, Heidi.
So very much. This was, please
Thank
let's do
you.
this again.
Thanks.
Thank
Please
you.
come back,
See
Pilar.
you soon.
Yes.
I'd love to.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Good
Thank
night.